Welcome to Alexa Developer Office Hours. It's me, Amanda. How are you all doing today? Thank you for stopping by. Those of you, I see we have a lot of lurkers today, so I'm just going to say a general hello. Hi, hey, Craig. How you doing today? How's your day going? We are here once again from my home studio in lovely Philly, PA, to bring you Alexa Developer Office Hours, our weekly show. Today we have a guest, Mav from AWS, currently on Alexa from AWS. We were having such a good conversation before we went live that I almost was like, oh shoot, I better hit the go live button. But we continue this conversation live. But before I do that, I want to do a quick announcement that our video team has been working super hard on some really, really cool videos, and I'm going to share those with you now by pasting those into the chat. The Voices of Alexa videos. If you haven't seen these videos, they are on our YouTube, and there's also posted up on blogs. They are super, super slick, cool videos highlighting some of our great Alexa developers internationally. So please do check those out. If you haven't had a chance to see that, we are just so proud of the work that our Alexa developers are doing all over the world. And we just want to share that with you. So do check them out. Excited to share those. And now, without further ado, we're going to go ahead and bring on our guest who's joining us today. Hello, Mav. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. I know it's a long reach to get you on the show, so we really appreciate having you here today. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about who you are, why you're here?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Mav. I'm a senior solutions architect at Alexa. I was with AWS for the previous 4 years, and I moved over to the Alexa team last year. So I've been with Amazon for just over 5 years now. Background, application development. I have been writing code for a very long time, and I've worked across a number of industries over the last 20 plus years.
It's really cool. A lot more Amazon, 5 years Amazon experience. So 4 years AWS and 1 year here at Alexa with all of us. But we specifically have you on here to talk about the AWS Alexa pipeline because you have so much AWS experience. And lately you've been sharing some cool blog posts that are featuring making Alexa better by making your backend better, basically. And so we're excited to talk about that. As I was mentioning before we got started here, I'm a relative AWS newbie because I was an Azure person for many years. And so my AWS skills are like, I'm still in the process of learning all this stuff about how to do proper Lambda creation and Alexa hosting. I pushed some websites up to AWS and I'm going to push some more up this week, but it's a little bit of back end, but not to the extent that you have under your belt. And I'm really interested to pick your brain and learn from you about the ways that we can make our Alexa skills better by doing these custom deployments. So one of the things that I put up already on the screen is your blog post about a development environment. I'm going to quickly share that in the chat because this is a really, really cool post. Sorry for all the spam in the chat today, but Alexa, here we go. And then I'm going to also put it up on the screen because it's very hands-on. And I thought it would be useful to sort of look at some of your screenshots and walk through. So what can you tell me about what this blog post is about and what we're working on if we're doing this, development environment wise?
Yeah, that's a great starting point. So the reason I put this blog post together was once I moved over from AWS over to Alexa, even though I had extensive experience working with different languages, different industries, there is, as always, there is plenty of ways of building skills. There is Alexa hosted skill with a web-based console that you can develop skills. There is CLIs. There was a plethora of ways of doing things, and they have pros and cons. So as I got to a stage where I felt comfortable that there was something that I considered as best practice, that basically meant best practice to me is actually being very, very productive. I can, build something quickly. I can test it, build my test suite, unit tests, etc., and I can actually deploy it. So once I've had that experience of getting to a stage where I felt comfortable talking to my customers, the partners that we work with that build skills, to recommend something that obviously meant that they could be productive. I thought it would be very useful to actually build it as a blog post and share it, and hopefully save a lot of time to people starting or people that are trying to find the best way of building skills. So that's the background to it. It basically would have saved me quite a bit of time when I was starting out building skills, had I had access to what I consider this ID best practice. So basically, the toolkit that I use Visual Studio Code, which I consider as a great ID. It's open source. I can run it both on my Mac and my Windows desktop at home. There is a great plugin for it, the Ask Toolkit plugin. Once you install that from the marketplace with Visual Studio Code, you're pretty much good to go. So you install it, you sign in, and basically you can create a new skill, or you can import one of your existing ones. So download and edit them. And it basically means that you don't actually have to go and touch the console or work through anything else. You directly work with the code locally. You can also test locally. There is an emulator that you can run. And all the deployments happens through basically committing to a Git branch. So it means that it forces you to have, best practice, if you like, because obviously all your changes cannot be deployed unless you actually make a commit. And once you make a commit, you push it over to the Alexa hosted skill. It will actually update your skill as well. So it's actually a very efficient way to both run the skill locally, test it locally as well. One of the things that I've captured in the blog post is how do you unit test the Alexa skill? And I kept it, very high level. I give, I think, only one example in the blog post, but I felt it was important to have like the end-to-end, development lifecycle, including the unit test as part of this blog post. I'm planning to follow up the blog post further down the line with an extensive unit test blog post where we go into depth covering different scenarios. But by going through this blog post, basically the idea is that at the end of, and I don't think it will take more than 5 to 10 minutes, you've got your ID set up, you've created a new skill, you've got a couple of unit tests up and running, and then the limit is your imagination, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I got down to the unit test part of the post. I've done the VS Studio ASK pipeline, and I do agree that it is definitely more robust than doing it in the dev console. Obviously, if you're a serious developer, you want to have access to those unit tests. You want to have access to the debugging that is provided by having like a proper dev environment. So, and the Git is also really nice. I set it up so I could push to my GitHub and to the Lambda at the same time. But I am still doing Alexa hosted right now. So it's nice that you can set that up when you're initially putting together your skill with ASK. You can choose custom, or you can choose that Alexa hosted provision your own.
That's right. Yeah. So it basically makes no difference other than actually selecting which one you prefer. So if you've got your own AWS account, you can still use exactly the same development setup and push it obviously, to the right account. Or even if you're using Alexa hosted, you can still use, the same ID setup.
Nice. House, we already have some folks chatting on Twitch, which I always love to see. We got Brian Tarbox here. Hi, from 34,000 feet on my way to a Hero Summit. Wow, I did not realize that was happening today. You're on the plane and you're saying hi, so we appreciate you being here and saying hello while you're up in the air. Good luck with the summit. Have a good time. Funny coincidence. We're talking about AWS and Alexa today, so he's one of our AWS heroes. David Curley on Twitch. One for Mav. Good. Got a question for you. Setting up a new self-hosted skill via the CLI, as one does, why would you choose the CloudFormation deployer versus the Lambda deployer? The CFN deployer wasn't around when I started building skills. I'm wondering why it's there. So what's the difference between the CloudFormation deployer and the Lambda deployer? Do you know that one?
Well, no, to be honest, I'm not familiar with the differences there, so I'm afraid I can't help with this one.
Oh, tricky. Maybe somebody in DAG has an answer. If not, they're going to look it up and let us know, or we'll put that on our list. Brian is deployed in the cloud. He's literally deployed in the cloud. He's in the sky, the actual cloud. We'll get you an answer, though, one way or another. Though, I don't know the answer to that either, because that one's new to me. Why would you choose CloudFormation? Alarna wants to know from YouTube, what are the best settings to set on Lambda for an Alexa skill? I'm sure you can take that one.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, it depends on how you define best settings. one of the things that I have come across is obviously the default limits when it comes to memory allocation and the timeout settings for Lambda. So a typical place where sometimes developers get stuck is they stick with the default limits. I think it's 128 megs, and the default timeout, maybe it's 3 seconds. I can't remember now, but it's pretty short. And they tend to be pretty good for a lot of the skills. But sometimes when you have skills that rely on a lot of backing services, it could be data connections, it could be other APIs that they have to go and collect information before the skill can respond. The typical issue is that the timeout is reached. And sometimes you have skills that can be memory intensive, and the timeouts or the running out of memory errors catch people out. That's the reason I put a second blog post, which we are going to cover in a moment. Because once I was happy with the idea, one of the things that I came across working with different partners that had some performance issues because of the Lambda settings, I realized that there was not a lot of information out there as to how you actually debug, how do you actually scale, instrument, monitor, and scale an Alexa skill. It doesn't differ from any other serverless application, to be honest. And that's the good thing, that you can actually take your skills and actually apply them. So typical catch out things on Lambda is memory and the timeout, the default timeout. I'd always advise my customers and my partners to obviously optimize your Lambda function. So it's giving it more memory and giving it more time. It's okay. But obviously you want to have a well-optimized function because it's more cost-effective. It tends to be, more performant. So don't rely on just giving it resources, because obviously it then tends to become, it works until the next bottleneck kind of thing. But those are the two settings that usually people need to optimize. The other one is if you want to apply observability, and we're going to cover in the second blog post, AWS X-Ray, you have to enable it in the Lambda function. It's either a CloudFormation setting, or you can go into the console and just tick the box and hit save. But again, we'll cover that in a moment.
Cool. Wow. Okay. That's a lot of info. I was actually taking notes because when I decide to go ahead and do my first custom Lambda as opposed to AWS hosted, I want to be sure that I get this info right myself, because I was supposed to Alexa hosted. Everything I've done so far has been Alexa hosted. So I'm looking forward to cracking this myself and getting into it. Your second blog post, is that the one from June? Do we want to go ahead and share that with the chat?
Yeah, we can cover that. Yeah. Yeah,
okay.
Sounds good.
I don't want to ignore these questions, so we've got so many.
Just a quick thought on the Lambda function. I personally, for my own skills as well, and when it comes to working with partners, I prefer to run my Lambda function in my own AWS account, as opposed to actually using the Alexa hosted one.
Right.
And the only reason I prefer to do that is because it gives me a lot more flexibility. So when we talk about observability with AWS X-Ray, AWS X-Ray is a service that has got a free tier, so it's actually free for me to run as an individual developer, but you don't have access to it through an Alexa hosted skill, because you get basically the bare bone functionality that you need to actually build the skill, and it tends to be okay for a lot of skills. But for the things that I work with, I tend to need quite a bit more. So, for example, I use DynamoDB for persistence, not just for what's happening in a user session or a skill session. Sometimes you might have a CMS running, and you want to create additional tables that hold the content, and then use the DynamoDB in addition to manage persistence for the session. And you cannot do that with an Alexa hosted skill. So it gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of what you can do to host the Lambda function in your own AWS account, because you still benefit from the free tier. It depends on the complexity of the skill as well, or it depends on where you are in your journey as a developer. If you're just starting out, Alexa hosted skill is absolutely fine. It will give you everything you need to build a skill. But as you build the complexity and your confidence in actually creating, engaging skills, people tend to actually need quite a bit more in terms of the rich ecosystem that AWS has got to offer.
Yeah, I can imagine that additional monitoring and the flexibility will give you a lot more options when you're more advanced and you're ready to move on to that next level of your developer journey. Alarna had another question. You probably can take this too. What's the best way to test locally?
Oh, look, again, it depends on the testing you're doing. So in the ID post, I think I touched on the unit tests. I tend to run the local emulator as well. Although I have to say, sometimes I prefer to use the one in the console when it comes to actually putting like user input and getting some feedback. But for unit tests, I just run, for Node, I run just locally, and I run my unit tests locally.
What about if you have a database? Is that database hosted on AWS, or is that database going to be something that you mirrored locally?
Well, look, if you're running a custom skill, so if you're running it on your AWS account, you can actually mock DynamoDB locally as well. I find that what works well for me, I run my unit tests locally, because obviously I mock the inputs and I mock some of the functions as well. So I can mock the DynamoDB response, right? So it means I can run it on locally, and I don't have to actually deploy to actually test. But for actual integration tests, I will deploy my skill and run my integration test against the skill using the emulator that comes with Ask.
Cool. That's a really helpful answer. Yeah, a lot of times when I'm working with a database, I also just have some kind of database that's local. I'm, MySQL, Dynamo, whatever it happens to be, and you're pulling from that. But there can be a little bit more of a challenge when you've got data in the cloud that you're trying to test from and pull from. Cool.
Absolutely.
I'm going to scroll up and look at some of these other questions before we go on to the second blog post, just so I don't lose anybody. I have this is a certification question, I think. So we might want to save that we're going to have a certification team on again soon, but I want to try and answer you now. Artifact Music on Twitch. I have a question on publishing my first skill. I think I need to follow more direct requirements for my privacy policy URL. I use account linking to connect to Spotify and force users to do this. I then retrieve the token and use some of the users' data to generate a playlist. I don't store any of the user's data on my side. What I need to include in my privacy policy URL. So I can sort of take this, and we can have DAG chime in if they have anything to input about this. Your privacy policy has to explain what data you take, why you take it, what you're using it for. And it's got to be a URL that people can access, that is up and running and works. Aside from that, you're basically good to go. Like if you don't actually store any of the user's data, say that in your privacy policy. Say, I don't store any of your data and I'm not using it for anything. Just be perfectly clear and honest about what you're trying to include. And then if you have any questions about that, like you submit it to certification and you're confused, like, like what exactly does this pass? Or if certification says, hey, you need to edit, blah, 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 just know that it's a conversation between you and certification, and they'll help you to get that massaged to correctly where you want to be. But basically, as long as you're clear and open about what you're doing with your user data and why you need it, and like your skill should not take any user data that it doesn't need for its functionality. So if there's any data you're taking just for the heck of it, you probably will fail cert. So be sure that that data you take is data you need. So it sounds like your skill, music-based skill, you're linking to Spotify, you should be above board there. Just be clear about what you're doing and you should be good to go with that. I'd click on your thing, but if I do that, it shows up on the screen. So I'll have to look at it later. Oh, and don't forget that if you enjoyed the Slack, you can always chit chat with us about it on there as well. People weigh in, give you feedback about that. So we'll have the link to that up on the board in a little bit. Alexa.design/Slack.
I don't know that.
Oh, not you. I forgot to mute her. That's okay. It's fine. She's used to me chatting about her all day. Okay, and Habuma's chiming in a little bit about the CFN deployment. Thank you for trying to chat and take that question. I always love our help from the community. People chat. Greetings from Panama. I'm kind of new coding and developing in Alexa. I've been trying to build on the Alexa dev console, but is there a big difference if I do it on a local editor, and what are the advantages? Mav, I'd love to hear from you about this. We were just talking about the difference between using Visual Studio Code versus the dev console.
Yeah, look, it's a great question. If you just want to have a quick play just to see what an Alexa skill looks like, and there's plenty of examples that use the console to get you started, the console is absolutely fine. But if you're an experienced developer and you're planning to invest time in building skills, and I think it's true of pretty much any development you're doing, you want to have an IDE that is performant, and you want to have the full suite of different things that you might want to tap into. And we're going to cover CodeWhisperer hopefully as part of this discussion further down the line. We're talking unit tests, so I don't want to have to jump between, obviously, the console to write a bit of code and then run my unit test on my local machine. You cannot run unit tests in the console. And when you are in the actual console, jumping between the bit where you actually write the code and then the test part of the console, obviously you have 2 or 3 seconds, depending on your connection and the performance of your browser, which I find it's wasted time. So I prefer to have my ID. Everything is really snappy. Everything is actually local as well. I can deploy when I need to. I tend to leave the console open and have my test and the debug section of the console, so I can put some input, into the skill and get the response back. But I will actually only code locally. It's just a matter of performance. And then I can run my unit tests. I've got a number of plugins that I run on Visual Studio Code. CodeWhisperer is one of them. Again, we're going to cover it in a bit. You cannot do all that stuff in the console. So in terms of my productivity, it's multiple times faster to actually work on on a full IDE as opposed to a cut down IDE, which is what you're doing when you are working in the console. It's the same thing that if you were a serverless developer and you were creating a Lambda or a serverless app, you'd still, it's okay to use the console. It's very, very similar to the Alexa developer console, but I wouldn't actually build a full-scale serverless app using the Lambda console. It's okay, but it's limited. It's cut down.
Yeah, I agree. Having done both, like my very first skill using the dev console and then moving to using Visual Studio Code, it's just, you can do a lot more robust coding. It's much more productive. You're doing everything locally, so it's faster. I think it's definitely a time saver. I think, not that the dev console in browser is bad, especially if you're just getting started. But I think if you're willing to take your skills to the next level, you definitely want to move that into that local dev environment.
Absolutely. Well, here's another example. If you wanted to do a comparison between the versions that you have got on the source control, running them on your Visual Studio Code setup, you can put side by side the changes that you want to do before you commit. You can't do that in the console. You hit save, it will commit the changes and deploy. And again, it's okay if you're getting started or you're having a bit of a play. But if you're doing this and you want to be fast and you want to be efficient, you just can't do that with the console.
Okay. Got a couple other questions coming in. This is great. Keep them coming, folks. Hey all, why am I not able to use node cache in Lambda? I'm sometimes getting null when I access the cache object. That one's new to me. Is that a bug, or is that just maybe there's an issue with their code?
Well, why are you using node cache would be my question. So if I was your AWS solutions architect, I'd be asking the question, like if you were my customer, I'd be asking why you're using node cache. I don't know the specifics, because obviously I'll need to look at the application, the package, and see what the error output is. Or is there any error that you are capturing? If the Lambda is exiting without actually capturing an error, it probably means that it's something is happening with the async nature of Node. But my question to you would be, why do you need Node cache?
Yeah, we'll follow up on that. Let us know what you're using it for. And as a reminder too, if you want somebody to look at your code, because a lot of times we can't share code directly on office hours, you can use that contact us. Dag will take a look at what you're working on and actually give you good feedback about what you're working on. If you need a little one-on-one, why doesn't this work or something like that. So contact us is always a feature that you can use if you have very specific questions. But yeah, let us know what you're using the node cache for. Maybe that'll help us to debug your problem. Next question, Voicerama. Why can't you adjust the Lambda settings for a skill in the dev console? Most importantly, memory size and currency. I'm thinking it's just because the dev console is stripped down compared to. Yeah,
and this is the bit where we were talking earlier about having a preference. So I prefer to run even my own personal skills. I will run them in my own AWS account. That's a big part of the reasons, because you actually have full control of the settings that you apply to your Lambda function, and you can use backing services like X-Ray to actually instrument and monitor what your function is doing. When you are using the Alexa hosted skill, it's okay for a wide variety of applications, but it's still a cut down service that you have access to. So you have access to the basic Lambda function with the default settings. Obviously it's free, and it's free forever. So if your applications can fit with that, great. But if you want to have full control, like being able to configure the memory, the timeouts, using X-Ray, concurrency levels, you need to go down the, running them in your own AWS account. You still benefit from the free tier, which is very generous. For a lot of my personal skills, there is no charge that I had to pay, pretty much ever. But obviously, I have the full control. If I'm building something that's a bit more complex and I want to tap into the configuration of the Lambda, I can do. And I personally quite like the, using CDK as well.
And I also want to remind you, I was looking to see if we had an on-screen banner, but if you don't know, we also have user voice. So if you want to vote on a particular, feature request, that's what I was looking for. Sorry, I was trying to find the link and talk at the same time. If you want to vote on a particular feature request that you think would be useful to have, like we do also have that user voice to, raise your excitement there. But I think the bottom line is if you want more control over what you're creating, you do have to do a little bit roll your own. You have to use the IDE. You kind of have to roll your own. It's just a give or take. Like, do you want the simplicity of really quick launching and really quick getting started, or do you want the flexibility of like a little bit more custom settings? And that's the reason why you would probably switch over to Lambda.
Yes, it's all about having additional control and the ability to actually customize it to your requirements. I think, the journey that a lot of developers follow is, you start with the hosted skills, and then, pretty quickly you have a good feel around what fits with the hosted skill. And for me, if I'm doing a quick proof of concept for a customer, a lot of the times the hosted skill is absolutely fine. If I want to demonstrate a particular feature or I've got a question, I was looking at the different formats supported by the video player. So the quickest thing I could do was, spun up Alexa hosted skill, create a media live endpoint where it was creating the different formats that I could think of, and then feed them all to the Alexa hosted skill to see which ones played and what formats were supported. So that was absolutely fine, right? To quickly verify something. But if it's a production skill for, perhaps, a bigger developer or a bigger org, you tend to want to have a little more control, and you go down to, your own AWS account.
So next question, and I think this dovetails into something that you wanted to talk about anyway, also from Twitch. Thank you very much for the questions, by the way. Are tools like Amazon CodeWhisperer or Code Guru recommended for reviewing and keeping cleaner code? And can tools be used for JavaScript, for TypeScript, and custom? You want to talk about CodeWhisperer. Let's talk about CodeWhisperer. What is CodeWhisperer? How does it make my life easier?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a great question. It was part of the topics that I wanted to cover today. So, you probably heard people talk about generative AI. CodeWhisperer is basically generative AI for coding. It is absolutely incredible. I'm a big fan. There is a great plugin for Visual Studio Code, so there is one more reason to run your own IDE. So once I've set up my, my Ask toolkit in Visual Studio Code, the very next thing that I set up is CodeWhisperer. It comes with a free tier, and it's basically free forever for individual developers. And there's obviously a business tier for teams, etc. But for individual developers like myself, the free tier is plenty, and it's exactly the same functionality. I do highly recommend using CodeWhisperer when you are coding. Period. Coding for Alexa, coding for anything else, definitely use CodeWhisperer, because it makes you, like multiple factors more productive. So like you write a function and you want to check if it's got security, potential vulnerabilities, select the function, you hit CodeWhisperer, it will tell you straight away if there is a security vulnerability or if it needs optimization, or if you've got an idea for a function that you want to write, instead of writing the function, testing it, figuring it out, you can actually write in natural language. I want to write a function that takes a JSON object, for argument's sake, and sorts out by a particular attribute descending value. You literally can input that as a comment and ask CodeWhisperer to write the function for you. So if you were writing a skill, you can save like 90% of the time. It's incredibly fast to actually write the function by just describing it. And the other thing that you can do with CodeWhisperer, which I find that is incredibly time-saving, and it tends to be an area where sometimes people cut corners, is you can ask CodeWhisperer to write the unit test for you. So literally you can say, write a jest unit test. I write Node, so obviously I use jest, but literally you can say, well, write me a unit test for this function. And we'll mock the inputs where it's required, or we'll ask you to fill in the inputs. But it's incredibly efficient way of creating new skills and maintaining the existing ones. Like you can save 80-90% of your time in terms of building something.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know when I start coding, usually what I'll do is write a big brick of comments saying this code needs to do this, and it needs to do that, and then it needs to do this, and needs to do that. And then I'll like break it down and decide like how to write that in code. You're telling me I could just highlight that comment and say, hey, CodeWhisperer, how do I write this code that does this, this, and that? And it will,
That's right.
It'll take a best shot at it. Oh,
absolutely.
That's going to save me a lot of time.
I was actually showing it to a colleague at work today. He was like, we're having a similar discussion. He said, are you using CodeWhisperer? I said, yeah, big fun. And literally, I did a quick demo along the lines of what I just described. I said, look, let's pretend we need to write a quick, function that processes a big JSON object. And I just wrote a quick comment on the back. It's option C to activate CodeWhisperer, and literally just gave a suggestion for a function, which was perfect. And to date, I haven't had an issue where it suggested the function, and I wasn't happy, if you know what I mean. Wow. It just saves all that time where you end up Googling stuff and then you go and visit Stack Overflow or other sites. Not that there's anything wrong, but it saves you those cycles of going back, researching, testing, works, doesn't work, go back, research, right? You jump straight into a working solution. That's
really cool. I'm looking to see how that'll improve my pipeline on the stuff that I'm working on. I'll definitely give that a shot. How do I install that on my IDE? You said it's option C, but you just have to install it as a plugin?
Yes. So you go on, if you're using VS Code, you can use a CodeWhisperer on any IDE, including Cloud9, which is an AWS web-based IDE, also pretty great. Again, I use VS Code. You go into the marketplace, you search for AWS CodeWhisperer, and you install it. It asks you to log in. So even if you don't have an AWS account, you can log in as an Amazon developer, again, free, and off you go. Really cool. It takes like a minute, maybe less.
Looking forward to doing that later this week and putting it through its paces. I've got some interesting stuff that I'm writing for hobby stuff, and it's really fun to play with.
Absolutely, and it's great in terms of refactoring as well. So literally, you can give it a function in Python and say, well, create a Node version. Or you can take a function that, maybe perhaps a bit of the older functions, monolithic, a few hundred lines, and say, well, refactor this, and, will output, an optimized version or break it down.
Well, thank you. That's a really awesome answer. I'm looking forward to that. Oh, I see some more comments in chat. I think we're just responding to some of the other comments. So thank you again, DAG team, for getting on top of those things. Next question from Ravender on Twitch. I want to deploy backend as a custom web server. Okay, interesting.
The question on that is why?
Yeah, why?
Like it can be done. There is documentation. If you look on the Alexa skills kit, there is documentation where you can actually deploy it on your own web server. But my question would be why? Because obviously, running the overhead of having a web server, even if you run it in a container service like Fargate or Kubernetes, there's quite a bit of overhead really, and you don't actually benefit from, having a nice, clean, serverless setup. So my question would be why? The years I've been doing this, and especially working for Alexa in the last year and a bit, I haven't come across a partner that has that requirement.
That really needed it.
Yeah, you just create a lot of overhead for yourself. I mean, if you look, if anything, pretty much the move has been towards serverless, not away from it.
Now, DAG has posted a link to our documentation in the chat. So if you want to check out that documentation and see if that's what you want to do, definitely read that through and see if that's the right way to go. It is a lot more work than the custom Lambda, and so maybe you don't necessarily need it, but if you do need it, you can do it. It's doable. Yeah,
and I see there's a great comment right there about when you deploy on your own server from, is it Robert Tables? He's talking about patching a server. I agree. If you run your own server, Alexa skill or anything else, there is a lot of undifferentiated heavy lifting that you're doing to maintain a server. So save all that energy and effort to actually build a great engaging skill that makes people happy and hopefully generates revenue for you, instead of doing something like maintaining a server.
Thank you. Thanks, Robert Tables. Thank you for joining us today, Rob. He's been watching my streams for a long time, so appreciate having you on the Alexa chat today. Oh gosh, I'm scrolling up. We've got so many more questions today. By the way, it's just been great having you answer all these thorny server / IDE questions. It's really fun. A couple questions related to the Alexa app. Okay, so this is about Alexa app stuff. If it's a feature request, post that in user voice, because that's something we'll have to look at as a feature request. So realize I don't control the hardware. I don't personally know. We do have a hardware event coming up in September where we're going to have some more hardware announcements. So be on the lookout for information about what upcoming hardware is going to be out there. It's not going to come from me on this show until after it's announced at the event. So definitely all of that will be something that we'll go over in the future. But if you have feature requests, user voice, vote those feature requests up. We definitely have a lot on our plate with what we're working on. So we're excited to share it with you when the time comes. And we got a few different conversations here going back and forth in the community. Thanks everybody for all the comments that y'all are making, and thank you for posting that user voice in the chat. Thanks on it, so appreciate you. Oh, we got through all that, and I didn't even put up your AWS X-Ray post, which we were going to talk about. So let's talk about AWS X-Ray. I'm going to go ahead and highlight that, and this is your post here that I shared earlier in the chat. This is from June that you made this post. And what is AWS X-Ray? And I need a custom Lambda to make this work, right?
That's right, yeah. So if you were to use AWS X-Ray, you need to be running your Alexa skill backend into your own AWS account. So AWS X-Ray is a service from obviously AWS, and it allows you to trace different requests and analyze them. So if you have a distributed application, which is what your Alexa skill is, you can basically figure out what it's doing. And the reason I wrote that post is because I came across certain partners that had either been developing a new skill or had mature skills in production. And from time to time, they were experiencing high latency, and they weren't quite sure as to where the latency was, right? So it was a bit of a black box. They were saying, well, we speak to Alexa, then sometimes it responds in 2 seconds, sometimes it can take 10 seconds to get a response, right? Working with those partners, we looked at the code, and you can use a service like X-Ray, and that's obviously the AWS solutions, but there's plenty of third-party solutions out there. And basically, it allows you to instrument the code. So you can put a few lines of code within your functions, and then you can find out what they are doing. So basically, you can create service maps. So your skill backend receives the request, and then you have a service map that shows you what your skill has done once the request came in. So for argument's sake, it spoke to DynamoDB, perhaps it reached another API, maybe Salesforce for some of our customers, or a different third party. It will tell you how long it took on a per request basis. And by having that output, then you can narrow down the different user journeys and the different requests to actually identify where the time is spent and hopefully identify where the bottleneck is. So for one of the examples I've used in the post, the way you set up X-Ray, if you're using the AWS console, you basically tick a box, hit save to enable X-Ray, and then you put traces in your code. So in the blog post, you will see you go and create segments, and you create annotations. So I create annotations in terms of best practice. You create annotations in your different handlers within your skill. And basically that allows you to go and search all the different handlers. So imagine a big skill that may have, 10, 20 different handlers. Once you've annotated them, you will be able to see as the requests are flowing through, how long each handler has taken. And more importantly, you can click through to the handler. Let's say you've identified one that has got high latency, and in the blog post there is one which is like 4 seconds, which I consider quite slow. Once you click through, then you can look at the different functions within the handler, like what were the calls that the handler made and how long did they take. And you will see the database writes as well. So in the example I've got on the blog post, it's quite a big mature skill. It does quite a few things, including third-party APIs, and it also uses DynamoDB. And basically will tell you how long it's taking to read and how long it's taking to write to the database. I was working with another partner a few months back, and we had a skill that was making 7 different writes per request.
Wow.
And obviously those 7 writes, add up. And, potentially if you're waiting to read once if you write your input to the database and then you want to read back, process the output, and then write again, then, that can add up easily to 7, 10 seconds. So by setting up X-Ray, the effort is pretty minimal, and you can switch it off once you've done the debugging and the scaling that you need to do. It doesn't mean that you have to be running it all the time. It samples. It doesn't process every single request. But the way that we run it with different partners and established customers is, once you have a scaling issue or you want to, debug performance, you flick on X-Ray, then you look on the console, have a look at what is taking the time, fix the issue, deploy, confirm through X-Ray that the problem has been fixed, and then switch off the tracing. It's a very, very efficient way to actually debug and scale an application. And I find it particularly helpful in scenarios where you might have a busy period coming up, let's say Black Friday, Christmas trading season, if you had an e-commerce platform, right?
Prime Day.
Yeah, exactly. You make your changes and you want to make sure that those will stand up to traffic. My personal preference is to run my load tests using X-Ray. So I will load test on my development environment and have X-Ray enabled, and I will look at my X-Ray traces and verify that I've got a platform that will scale as I expect before live traffic hits it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's always good to be able to load balance and make sure that people aren't hitting. And what you said about latency, 10 seconds seems like an eternity if you're waiting for a voice application to respond to. 5 seconds is super
100%.
long. It's super long. It feels like even 3 seconds really feels really long. If you're waiting, if you're waiting. So I know that if it doesn't respond to me right away when I ask a question, I automatically think, oh, she didn't hear me, and I say it again. So yeah, It's definitely worth it to do that testing to be sure that you're getting that quick response from people. I did post the blog post on the screen, but it's very detailed and there's a lot of code. It's really in depth. So I just posted that in the chat as well. So if you want, I posted the chat before, but if you want to take a look, there's a lot of really cool info here that actually shows exactly how it works with arrows and explains the analytics that you're seeing and everything in the post. And you also want to talk a little bit about analytics today, and content analytics, how I can get the most out of what I'm looking at with my analytics and my skills. So maybe we could just talk a little bit more about that too, because I need to know not just this, but what else can I learn from Alexa Analytics?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will be publishing a blog post in detail in terms of Alexa content analytics.
Cool.
But I wanted
That's
to
coming
cover
up?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Oh, great.
That's coming up hopefully pretty soon. So basically, one of the things that, obviously I realized again, working with, Alexa partners is, from time to time there is, content heavy skills where it could be, audio assets, video assets, or even text assets, and actually being able to understand what content has been served, how long it took, and different aspects of the skill. Can be quite hard for people. So one of there's an open source project called Alexa Content Analytics for those that use Node that you can install on your skill. You can install the Node package, and basically then you can instrument your code to emit events. So the event you emit is the piece of content that you have served. And you get a choice in terms of the endpoints that you are emitting your analytic events to. So you can send them directly to Google Analytics if that is your preferred analytics provider. I tend to use Amazon S3 to store my events, and I use Amazon QuickSight for my reporting. So I have a completely serverless analytic pipelines where all my data goes in one place, and that will be covered in the blog post as well. So the analytics package will emit those events, store them in Amazon S3, and then you can use QuickSight to, basically, report on which pieces of audio, which pieces of video, what were the, different pieces of content that you have served.
Cool. It'll be interesting to see that in action with everything else. And I imagine if you're doing like a game skill, for example, you have a lot of content, like a lot of trivia questions or something. Be really good to be able to audit that.
That's right. Yes, we actually have a use case right now where we are implementing content analytics, which is quiz. So we're looking at actually firing off the different quiz states that people reach, and the different paths that they are following, to actually being able to understand what is the actual user behavior,
Right.
how many people are completing different sections, etc. Well, in one of the examples that we've used content analytics was audio assets rather.
Oh, okay,
And we were able to identify things like playback failed. So we had a customer that had quite a few pieces of content. On one of them, the actual stream wasn't working, and you can actually pick it up through the reporting and say, well, okay, there's one item where the playback will not start, and here it is, let's go and fix it. It can be quite hard otherwise. The other thing that is quite helpful through content analytics is if you actually add the package in the interceptor for the skill. If you remember, there is a response interceptor and a request interceptor. And in the blog post, I cover both. So my default starting point is, if you're not going to add your analytics everywhere, at least add it there, because it means you're going to capture every single request. And you get a lot of those analytics through the console anyway. But you get additional information by adding it to your interceptor. Because if you have things like, if you're playing audio,
Right.
a lot of developers don't actually understand that there is quite a few requests that hit your skill outside the session, right? So you might think that, well, I've asked Alexa to play a particular piece of audio, so that's one request to my skill. Well, actually, that could be 6 or 7, depending on how you structure it, because you have things like playback started, playback nearly finished, playback finished, right? And people don't understand that these are all calls back to the skill. And they don't have that visibility. So if anything, if you don't do anything else, you add it to your interceptor, and you'll be able to see what is your skill doing at all times. And as you build your experience, you can actually instrument it a bit more, especially if you have content heavy, because again, that's why it's called Alexa Content Analytics. Right. If you're content heavy, potentially you have a marketing team that's trying to understand what content is working, what isn't. It's a great thing to do, to actually instrument it, to actually have proper analytics as you would have on a mobile app, as you would have on a website.
Right. Yeah, it's, if you have like a sound that's designed to play forever, maybe it doesn't do that. But if you have a sound that just plays a short amount of time, you got to figure out what to do when that sound is done playing, right? So it's another callback to the skill.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and you have quite a bit of control, even if you have long form audio, right? The session finishes and you play a piece of audio that is 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes long. When that audio finishes, there will be a request sent back to your skill. Yes, it's out of session, but you could actually queue another piece of audio. You could actually do other things if you actually know that that is happening. It's a great way of understanding the life cycle of the skill, depending on what content it is that you are serving.
Really looking forward to seeing that blog post when it comes up, and we'll talk about it when it gets posted. I'll talk about it here on the show too, to make sure people follow up and see, because I'm curious to know how that goes. I don't want to leave behind any of the comments in chat, so I scroll back up. Question about web API for games. Now, we've had the web API team on here, but it's been a while, and I don't like. So the question is, any tips on syncing speech mark with HTML API for games? It's fine for shorter responses, but seems to get off by 500 ms to 1 second on longer responses. That is a great question. I know when we had Chris from the games team on here, he said that what he was doing was more of a sound font, where he would actually record the words that he was saying and play that as opposed to using like a text to speech, because I can imagine you might get a little bit of latency. But I know you also asked that question on the Slack, so we'll be sure to have somebody from Games team take a look and see if they can give you a better response. Then maybe that's not the approach if it's a longer response. I think with games, like having custom audio is pretty important to user engagement, but it can be like a lot of work, especially I think he said he was recording like individual numbers and letters himself, like numbers in particular for a timer. And he was like saying all the numbers aloud so that he would have like actual words. So there might be some challenges to getting it to sync with longer voice clips, but we'll definitely like look at debugging that. And if you really are stumped, use contact us. But yeah, I saw your question in Slack earlier, so we'll definitely give you a better response than that. And if anybody in DAG knows the answer to the latency on voice with the sound in HTML web API for games, let us know about that one, and we'll take note of that. What else we got? I have to scroll down here. Oh, lots of chat today. Thank you so much, everybody, for just being here and chatting. Alarna asks, so X-Ray will allow me to search easier for the Alexa ID rather than having to look through CloudWatch logs. Is that right?
Well, look, that's one way of putting it. I think if you're familiar with tools like X-Ray or another popular one is New Relic and Datadog, the thing is how you make complicated information meaningful, right? And actually being able to visualize it and actually group it together on a per request basis is what makes the difference. Because when you look at CloudWatch logs, what you have is a stream of events. Potentially you might be looking multiple requests from multiple users and not being able to understand which part of the logs relate to a particular request. If that makes sense, because all you see is the log line, right? When you look at X-Ray, you see a trace for a particular request. So you'll see the ones that have worked well, but then you will be able to spot the one that had the high latency and click through, and you will see the different calls that it has made. So yes, it's similar information to what you will get in a log aggregator like CloudWatch logs, but what you actually have is a visual representation of them and grouped by trace of the request. So it makes an enormous difference in terms of how quickly you can actually identify the one that is slow. The difference is, you can do something in minutes that potentially will take you hours or days if you don't have a tool like X-Ray. So regardless of whether or not you're working on an Alexa skill or not, any application, even if it's old school and it's not serverless, make sure you have good instrumentation and make sure you have a tool, if not X-Ray, a tool like X-Ray. If you're managing a production system that has a level of traffic, it makes an enormous difference in terms of how much time you're spending to actually identify the cause. You can jump straight from what is going on to, okay, it's this request that are taking longer. And it's that API that is being called that is delaying everything, right? It's huge in terms of how much time it saves you.
Yeah, 90% of coding is debugging. You write some code and then you figure out if it's working or not, and why isn't it working or why is it working? Or
That's right.
I spend so much more time tracking down problems than I do actually implementing the code. So anything that makes that process, which can be very tedious, that and like setting up environments and everything is like 30% of my time. But
that's right.
Anything that makes those processes simpler, right, is going to help you out a lot on your journey.
80% of the development effort, as a rule of thumb, and this has been true for decades now, 80% of the development effort is post-launch. So it's the maintenance phase.
Yeah.
So, anything you have, and look, we are, developers, right? We're all builders, we're all creative people. We want to spend our time building new cool stuff as opposed to trying to figure out, which piece of code is delaying things and frustrating end users, right? You want to be delighting customers. You don't want to be frustrating people or wasting your time trying to figure out what's going on.
It's so I don't want to say it's disappointing, but it's the price you pay, right? It's the real work that you put in to make, because the minute that thing you've written encounters real users, they're always going to find stuff that you don't find.
Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah. Next question in chat: do you recommend coding Alexa front end intense conversations with ACDL instead of using the build tab? And Habumba chimed in on that. It just depends on your needs. I think, like we mentioned, like he mentioned here, ACDL is Lambda hosted only. So if you're Alexa hosted, you have a different option. It just depends on what you need to do. So Mav, you recommend the Lambda hosted because if you're ready to make that leap, just because of the flexibility, right?
That's right. Yeah. When you are using, like in a nutshell, when you are using an Alexa hosted skill, you get what you need to build a basic skill. Usually, for a lot of the use cases, it's okay. You'll get your DynamoDB table where you can actually persist certain things. You get an S3 bucket where you can, save a few images, a few assets. You get everything you need for a basic skill. But if you're familiar with AWS, you're familiar with the services, and you want to have full control of what you're doing on the platform, including things like adding some instrumentation, some observability, then you need to run it on your own account, and then you have full control of the setup. So for my things personally, unless I'm doing a quick proof of concept where I want to verify something or I want to show or demonstrate something, I tend to just set it up straight away on my own AWS account, even if it's a personal project. And then I've got full control of it. I don't have the limitations of what is offered as a free service in effect with the Alexa hosted skills.
Mm-hmm. Not to scare anybody away from Alexa hosted, especially if it's your first time developing skills, because it's a very quick and easy setup. But once you need that additional flexibility, the custom skill is going to be a lot more flexible for you, and easy to create either of those from your IDE. When you first set up, if you're doing VS Code, it's one click different. You log into your Amazon account and you set it up from there.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, it feels like this hour just flew. I still have like a bunch of questions, but we're almost out of time. Is there anything else we didn't cover? I feel like we talked about all the important stuff. Talked about CodeWhisperer. We talked about analytics. We talked about what you got going on next for blog posts. Anything you want to say to the rest of chat before we have to sign off for today?
Well, thanks for having me. I think there were some great questions there. Really, really interesting conversation. I'd love to hear what people are building at some point, and if there's anything I can help with. My mission in life, if you like, I'd like to work on a lot of projects around reducing developer friction. I'm very, very keen to apply the experience I have in terms of building solutions. And actually look at either open source projects that we can build together to, like Alexa Content Analytics, but look at how we can make the skill set that people have transferable quickly to actually building an Alexa skill. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, and just whatever you're developing, whatever kind of developer you are, you can probably make an Alexa skill because it's pretty flexible. There's a lot of different ways to do it. We see new types of skills all the time. I put the Slack up on the board. If you're not on the Slack, you can join the conversation there and we can keep chatting. I would tell, normally this is what I tell you about next week, but I'm still trying to be sure that I get my guests locked in for next week. So check out our Alexa Office Hours webpage if you want up-to-date information about what we're doing next week, following week, etc. Thank you so much, Matt, for being on the show today. It's been a real pleasure. Gosh, I feel like I've learned a bunch just in this conversation. So I can't wait to get started trying CodeWhisperer. I really want to launch into that. And some of this other stuff that we talked about, X-Ray, seems really cool. Thanks a lot for being our guest today. And thank you all for joining us. We will see you next time.